Richard Phillips, who is the founder and senior partner of Crossroads Capital. He founded this boutique M&A advisory firm to help companies in the middle market with actionable data-driven intelligence to make better strategic decisions. Seasoned deal maker, accomplished financial analyst, over 20 years of corporate finance, management, accounting, and investment banking experience. He's worked on over 38 M&A and other strategic transactions valued over $6.5 billion. So no small feats by any means, across several industry sectors, defense, civilian, but light industrials have been the primary sectors of focus there. And his company, Crossroads Capital, offers unique blending market research with advanced modeling to help companies select the journey and help them prepare for their corporate development, bringing an in-depth multidisciplinary approach to advising on these M&A transactions. This type of expertise allows them to efficiently execute on conventional transactions, as well as tackle intricate projects like technology transfer, complex joint ventures, and strategic partnerships. And at this point, I'm happy to hand it over to you, Richard. Please take it away.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and let's get started. Always great to be with the pulse of GovCon. Today, we want to talk about exit considerations and position your company for optimal exit, and some things to keep in mind. And we'll start by assessing the business. You want to clarify and understand your unique value proposition. Get your narrative right. You want to understand the drivers and sources of value. And we're going to spend, I think, in no other document of your diligence list, if you will, can you see that more articulated, for good or for bad, perhaps, in your pipeline. So much you could read into that, and so we'll get into that a little in a moment. But also at the same time, just like you would understand the competitive landscape for the things you're bidding on, understanding the buyer landscape and its implications for the kind of deal and path forward you choose. Based on where you are, based on the market you're in, and based on your size and what you have internally, certain doors will be open and certain might be closed, and you want to be cognizant of that before you begin. And so, we want to just tie it all together with just exit preparation and optimal positioning and best practices there to give you some guidance as you're thinking, as you prepare and position your company for sale in the future. So can we next slide, please?
All of a sudden, I am unable to move to the next slide. There we go. Sorry about that.
When it comes to strategic decisions in your business, we could break it down really in three ways. You could buy, acquire, you could exit or sell, or you could build. So two of these are kind of, you could say, are external, and the one is more internal. You're greenfielding or what have you. You're focusing on internal growth opportunities, and you want to ask yourself where you go on this decision tree. Okay, what do I have right now? What do I want? And how do I get there? And these pathways will kind of help you guide, and also give you the sense of what your timeline and what the art of the possible is. Those are important considerations when you're kind of synthesizing these conditions. We can move on to the next slide, please. So when we're positioning for exit, we want to, diligence is, as you could imagine, is an important item that buyers or strategic partners will spend pretty much all their time kind of understanding. They want to know where your value propositions are. They want to de-risk a transaction for that buyer or for that strategic partner. And the two first things, we do probably do more buy-side work. In fact, we do more buy-side work than sell-side work. And the first two things I ask for are detailed contract waterfall. And then, in some ways, more importantly, a well-articulated detailed pipeline. And by ascertaining the veracity of those things and how detailed they are and how much of vision they give me into the company strategy and other things, I'm able to determine, okay, is this something we want to go after? Is this fit our strategic needs? Or is this a little too far afield and it's maybe not as good of a strategic fit as we originally thought? based on whether it be website, reading of a capability statements, and things of that nature. And so, we find a lot of companies that are not ready. And I would say to any business owner, whether, be ready for yes, and be ready to run your business like you're going to have it forever, but be ready to sell it tomorrow. If you run your business that way, I think you're going to be happy with the results at exit, but you're also, I believe, going to run a much more efficient operation, and a lot of these problems can be solved years before that change of control, or you're preparing for that change of control. Often what we see in a lot of pipelines too are contradictory narratives, that I'll see something in a pipeline that is completely opposite or contradictory to what the capability statement or the website or even the company's mission statement, wherever you want to see the messaging of the company and what's the work they're going after and the work they say they can do is not, there's a disconnect there. And that shows me there's not a lot of strategic thinking. It's kind of throw spaghetti at a wall. There's not we'll get lucky, we hope, what we go after, but there's not a lot of centralized thinking and sort of planning. As much, I don't not to speak highly of centralized planning, but there needs to be a hierarchy of thinking here of, okay, this is how we're going to go after this. This is what we're going to put in. If you're going to be sharing these waterfalls and pipelines, you want to make sure they convey the right messaging about what your company feels it has the best chance of winning, where its capability, really what you're messaging more than anything else is where you see your capabilities and where the customer is going to value those capabilities. And that's why you're going after the work you are. And so once again, the kitchen sink, throw everything at a wall or at spaghetti at the wall, hope whatever sticks. More is better. More is not better in your pipeline. More is not better necessarily in your in the contract wins you have, because there's an opportunity cost, as you all know, for taking on certain work, and low margin, low commoditized work, if you will, is not really going to message that value proposition that makes you unique, because companies sell in the industry from top to bottom. And that really doesn't, it depends more based on your size, but capabilities drive transactions, not cash flows. Cash flows are important, don't get me wrong, but capabilities and customer access, I would say, if real estate's location, GovCon, M&A is in the lower middle market, in the medium-sized enterprise is capability, and then maybe customer access, but specialized customer access, because the higher end buyers really are in no want of more capacity, more scale, and they probably have the customer relationships they need. They could always expand and get them deeper and leverage that customer intimacy with an acquisition. But more than anything else, where they tend to be light, even the big guys are on the capability side. So if you could show that you have something unique, you're going to be more valuable and you're going to attract more interest. We can move on to the next slide, please. And this ties to what we were just talking about. A lot of companies I see in the lower middle market, or in the middle market generally speaking, and not just GovCon, but perhaps in particular, we see it a lot in GovCon, is the lifestyle business versus what I would describe as the more corporate-minded institutional business. Lifestyle businesses, they're trying to generate short-term cash flow. They're nothing wrong with those, but they're less saleable, and they're going to attract less buyers at lower multiples. The more you create a corporate infrastructure, the more you institutionalize yourself, that if you get hit by a bus tomorrow, the business will run as well as it did when you were there. That is a more institutionalized business, that things aren't just in the owner's head. They're tied into processes, into the DNA of the company, the operations of the company, and there's that second tier of management, indirects that are managing the business. And it could run. You go to Tahiti for 2 weeks, you don't lose a beat. And that's you have to decide what you are and what you can be. And if you're not there, how do you get there? And lifestyle company has very few. Private equity buyers aren't interested in those. typically. I mean, if they are, they're independent sponsors that are paying very low multiples, and it's not the best outcome for you from a valuation standpoint, certainly. But if the more institutional the business, the more attractive it is. And how do you get there? And we could, there's certain, ways to de-risk the organization or just show and demonstrate that kind of level of institutional maturity that will pay off at exit for sure.
Richard, I had a question come through for you. If capability drives and it is an aspirational place for a buyer in which they really don't know a capability, how do they validate it? Is there some sort of fear of missing out going on in the sense of I want it, but I really don't fully understand it?
That's actually a very good question, because I mean we see that all the time, and that's swinging for the fence M&A sort of transaction. If you can make it work, it really works, because it's in that you're able to really take advantage of some growth opportunities. But it's hard to the question, hard to validate, and that requires a much deeper diligence from that buyer. Even if the issue of diligence, you have this information asymmetry between buyer and seller. You know your company more than that buyer will ever know your company, and how easy you make that for them is a big part of how that process goes. And for them, they will treat it, they will discount it, they will see it valuable, but it's a probability function for them. It's like, well, what are our chances of pulling this off? So for you as the seller or as the company trying to communicate this value to them, and they maybe don't fully understand how to bring that capability to bear, but they know it's important and they've heard it from their customers, is a matter of you could solve that for doing it in an articulate way, but also you solve for that in structure too. You solve for that in equity role. You put your money where your mouth is. Like, okay, we were going to help you leverage and harness that synergy and that capability into the customer, and we're willing to put our money where our mouth is and get paid equity role or earn out based on pay for performance. That's probably the best way to sort of bridge the gap between that uncertainty gap, that information asymmetry gap. But it's a heavy lift for that buyer. But when we'll get into it in a moment, the better you communicate and the more pure play that you are, the more believable you are to deliver that capability. And then once again, in pipeline too. Pipeline sort of speaks to that. Waterfall, past performance, speaks to that. But if you see these things all gel together, it gives that buyer much more confidence that you understand the customer, you understand the need, and you know how to integrate that capability into that, and have the customer intimacy, the look around corners, be able to deliver that solution. So this speaks to what that lifestyle business versus a corporate institutional business in a slightly different way, but the same concept is at play here as well. So at the maroon side, at the left here, we see lifestyle businesses that have the least exit options, the least buyer interest. It's more of a financial engineering play, cash flow play. It's like buying a bond, if you will. And there's not a lot there. And so the less sophisticated, the smaller, the less well-heeled buyers are there. And so even if they understand there's great capability there, they can't do a heck of a lot with it. And so they can't pay up for it, and they don't, because they can't do much with it. You want to move towards that lime green side of the thing, where it's more valuable and it's more of a storytelling. And what we explaining and having the buyer understand your unique value proposition, your capabilities, and where that level of customer intimacy that allows you to deploy it in a smart way to fit a customer need that's timely and based on that knowledge you have and the ability and the capability to deploy it. And so you can see as you move towards the right of the little bubble here, you get more sophisticated buyers, more of them, and ones that are able and willing to pay because they have the resources to harness that value proposition if you communicated it properly. So when okay, is my company ready to sell? When you're thinking about that, and you could ask yourself some of these questions. We kind of hit on a few of them already, right? Replicable. To what extent does the business run without you? Once again, that getting hit by a bus thing. You have to think that, take that into your thinking. How much of it is cooked in your head, the BD, all that. Institutionalize that. Get that down on paper. Get that into systems. Business process automation. When and where you can. Build efficiencies. If you're the owner, you shouldn't be billable. Your key indirect shouldn't be necessarily billable either, because when you change your ownership, means that money walks out the door. And often on deals, we talk about add backs. Well, this would be the opposite of an add back, because when you leave, that money leaves. And so we're deducting, me as, like I said, I would suggest to any person ready to sell or thinking about selling or putting them in a position to sell, think like a buyer would. And so, they're going to, trust but verify everything you say and do and everything you have done in the business. Keep that in mind. And the more you want to, once again, I think that there's one lesson to take away from today. If you're an owner, don't be billable. Understand existential risks and uncertainty in the business. And we kind of talked about this a little bit too. There's certain things that are existential to business. We lose a huge contract. We don't get that recompete. All of a sudden, our value proposition and our value in the marketplace changes significantly. Do we wait till we're on the other side of that? Now, in this business, there's always a recompete coming up, and there's always, finding that pure and perfect inflection point is, and timing that market is difficult, if not impossible. Your typical deal will take you 6 to 9 months. And that doesn't even count the prep work you're doing and thinking about as you're preparing for sale. And so you want to be able to be on the other side of those risks, or at the very least quantify them. And then it's a matter of, okay, then that buyer can understand them, and then and has confidence that you understand them. And then it's a matter of, okay, there's pricing adjustment, escrows, things you can do to adjust to correct for it. But if there's anything that, if you answer yes, if there are existential risks and really business changing uncertainty, well, going to market may not, with that hanging over your head may not be the best idea. Every time I do a kickoff on a deal, I will do what I call pre-mortem. Okay, I've heard about how wonderful your business is. This is how we think we'd approach it. Now tell me what you didn't tell me, why this deal doesn't close at the 11th hour. What keeps you up at night? What is sort of an existential threat that we haven't been aware of? The unknown unknowns, I guess, or maybe the known unknowns. And why, what can we be proactive about now? And what can we insulate the business to some extent, or at least quantify that risk? And another item to think about is how you compare to your peers in whatever grouping you are, small business or under, and also that has some thinking about, where you fit in the competitive landscape. You don't want to, you're a $20 million business, comparing yourself to Lidos isn't appropriate. Comparing yourself to companies within that range, and you could use a number of the, the tools and data sources out there, whether it be Deltex, obviously the Pulse of GovCon has some wonderful things to give you some insight, gauge report. The nice thing about this industry, a lot of information is knowable, whereas in some of the private, markets or more commercial markets we work in and our colleagues work in, a lot of this stuff isn't knowable. In the GovCon market, with homework, there's a ton of intelligence out there, and the folks at the Pulse know this better than most, and so leverage that and do your homework, and know where you fit in your peers, and they will discount and give you premium based on where you fit in that specific cohort you get put in. Move on to the next slide, please. And this just gives you a timeline, a deeper timeline of prepping for sale, what experts to deploy and when. Now, I'm not going to be so self-promotion to say you need an investment banker to do a deal. You don't necessarily, and it really depends on the nature and the size of the auction you're going to run. But you do need someone. Yeah, I would say you would absolutely need a transaction attorney. You want to talk to your financial planner, your wealth management. You want to be able to insulate yourself from the tax burden or of that liquidity event to the extent possible. You want to, as you're prepping for sale, maybe you put somebody internally in the company in charge of that. You may not need a banker, but you do. I wouldn't be negotiating yourself. Find maybe one of your subordinates that's sort of a key employee that is going to be taking over with Newco, and and incentivize them accordingly to work with you on the project, and do the diligence or prepare the diligence, the data room, the financial modeling that's required, getting the document management really in place, and have a captain, if you will, to kind of take that quarterback that function, and integrate with the other pieces as you need them. Whether it be investment bankers, accountancies to do. A lot of people want to do valuations. Valuation is probably less valuable than consider quality of earnings. I think that has, depending on the size, and it might be overkill with a lot of smaller deals, but a lot of buyers look for those where 10 years ago it was a nice to have. Now it's become more table stakes. And just briefly explain what we mean by quality of earnings. We really want to understand in your business what's recurring and what's not, from a cost perspective and from a revenue perspective, and are those buckets, as opposed to an audit that, okay, you fit GAAP standards and it's less operationally focused. A quality of earnings gives a sense of ongoing operations and what's recurring. And so it gives a much better look into pro forma analysis and pro formas, what's going to look like in the future based on certain changes. And so you work through this process of prep, and then you run a deal on this decision tree, and a deal will take you 6 to 9 months typically. It could take less, depending on how whether you're running an auction or just a negotiate transaction with a particular buyer that you know. The same way I would recommend you think about buyers is the same way, and most of the folks on the call will understand, it's the same way you think about teaming partners, perhaps, or that competitive landscape. The same way you think about potential collaborative strategic folks is the same way you might think about who ideal buyers are. Maybe your primes, or maybe some folks that you beat out on the last contract. They might, they bid on it, they didn't get it. Now you could argue that they were interested enough to go after that contract. Maybe they would find a lot of value in bringing you into in your organization, into the fold, taking on that work and building on that past performance. I don't know if there's any questions here. I hope this is clear about how you kind of, you take the longer to prep, or you can go right to market, depending on what your time frame is.
I actually do have one for you, Richard. What are the personal family dynamics to prepare for?
Yeah, that's a good thing to consider as well, and often see it less so in GovCon than in sort of light manufacturing or manufacturing, but do your whether it's your father, son, whether it's husband, wife, whether it's whatever it is, have an understanding of who do they want to take it over. Well, then maybe that is not a sale. Maybe that's a management buyout. Maybe it's have those conversations early, and those dynamics. Yeah, the idea is to get everybody's interest aligned, and it can have those interests understood by all the parties. Often what we see in so many deals, and not just GovCon, but my colleagues will tell you the same thing, that interfamily dynamic where, or even with partnerships, they have different interests and what they want and when they want it. And that everybody understands what those are, and you could kind of solve for that function once you know that. But I think transparent communication between those principles, whether they're family or not, and I can tell you, often on the buy side, we adjust. There might be 3 partners in a business. We listen to each one of them, what's going to motivate them, and we treat them different in the letter of intent and indication of interest that we're making. We might buy one partner completely out. We might let one roll equity more. It's we could tailor that, but we need to be communicated to what those preferences are. And so I would have those conversations. and decide from that what the best path forward is, and the transparency and keeping interests aligned is key to throughout that process, is key to keeping those folks on board in a productive manner, in a manner that moves the ball forward. And this just speaks to breaking down of a deal process, and we'll see it in another slide that's just more specific. But kind of what we're talking about today, probably more than anything else, we're talking about step one: uncover all those sources of value, understand yourself inside of out in the business, and be able to communicate that narrative and that value proposition to buyers. And the more, once again, the more pure play you are, I think the easier that story is to understand, and the more believable, to the earlier question, you can deliver on the capabilities you state you have. And so you can see how, over a period of, let's call it 6 months to up to 9 months, figure out who the buyers are. You customize the approach to those buyers depending on how many there are. Then you do your outreach, put a process on it. You make your case of those buyers. You work through diligence. This is another case where preparation helps a great deal. This is where deals fall apart between step 4 and step 5. The more prepared company can weather that storm and manage that in-depth examination with much less pain and distraction. And I think you see, perhaps more than anywhere else in a deal, where that preparation pays off in that step between step 4 or 5. You could perhaps 6 as well, but that 4 or 5 is, many deals will go sideways at that point for companies not as well prepared, and something to keep in mind.
Richard,
Richard, I had a question.
Go ahead, Haley.
Go ahead. So when we talk about pitching to the government, a lot of times, like white papers, capability statements, we talk about personalizing them to your target agencies. How much of that comes into factor here? Is it more of like, dump everything, give all of your potential buyers the whole truth, or do you want to target maybe different aspects of your company to different buyers?
Well, you want to, that's first, you want to understand your buyer pool. That's how you could triage this. So you understand your buyer pool. Some, may have certain interests in one area and not at all in other. Now, I'm not saying you break up your company based on, they only want one piece, or it's an asset sell one contract. But know your buyer and being able to communicate. For instance, in our sims, we often will try to put, the buyers into kind of buckets, if you will, and what would attract them to it. A PE is going to have a different field that doesn't have a platform than one who does, and then we speak to that platform and how it fits for them. And so, I think the time you spend in trying to make that strategic case, like I said, think like a buyer. Why is it important to them? They're not just buying a cash flow, because there's a ton of companies that could buy. Why yours? And you would tailor it to the extent that's practical and the extent that's possible. But the more you could do that, absolutely better.
Thanks.
We had another one come in from the audience. You mentioned using a key person to run or help negotiations. And if you have a business with unique capabilities, it's most likely made special by a few subject matter experts. What's typical to lock down those master SMEs?
Yeah, with so many companies like this, the value gets on an elevator or, every day. And so what do you do to keep those folks? You want to, when I'll see in a sim, for instance, an org table. Well, here's what it is today. But I'm like, well, 3 of these people are going. So it's not when I'm buying this, is not the org table I'm buying. And so identify those people in the documentation, in what they call the confidential information memorandum. Understand, communicate with them early in the process that you don't want to surprise them in the last minute. Oh, by the way, we're going to sell to Arlington Capital tomorrow. You want them involved from the get-go. Involved, not overly involved, but you want to bring them in sooner rather than later as a general rule. You want to incentivize them. You want to make sure that the buyer understands that these are key people, that if you keep them, you keep a lot of that value, and you keep a lot of that capability that is cooked into that individual, into their ability, and into the work they're doing for the company. So communicate that to the buyer. These are the key people, and this is why, and this is how this is the the flight risk, or you want to minimize that flight risk with specific reasons, whether they're being incentivized and that the buyer has been communicated. You've communicated with the buyer who they are and why they're incentivized to stay. Did that answer at all? I hope that answered that question. Here's a little bigger, a little bit more in-depth breakout of what the actual sell-side process would look like based, so a deal your banker would run, an M&A advisor would run, typically. Now, certain these things can be truncated depending on the nature of the buyer pool and the nature of the process. But generally speaking, this is what you're looking at. That first 2 months is prep. But but hopefully you've done a lot of prep beforehand. That makes this a heck of a lot easier. It's really material drafting, material creation, tailoring it to the particular buyers, understanding who the buyers are, understanding what their preferences are. Often what we'll do on a pre-market basis, on a no-names basis, we want to test our investment thesis. Like, we think these 40 to 100 buyers like it. Let's talk to them first on a no-names basis. Like, are they in the market even? Because that will change, how we approach the market. If they're not, if they just did a big acquisition and their appetite is full for the time being, maybe that if they're such a key buyer, maybe that tells us to hold off, or maybe that tells us, maybe we have to think about what our approach is a little differently. But that first 2 months, and you could be a little bit open-ended in that first period, that what I would call that month 1 to month 2 period. When the clock starts ticking, because time kills, and just like a house on the market too long, you don't want to be out there engaged in outreach for too long. You really want to, to the extent possible, minimize this orange, or whatever that color, I guess it's orange, that color is. And when you're out in the market, you're talking to I don't want to say strangers, but folks that know you, but don't really know you all that well. Because that's how, you're at your highest risk for confidentiality exposure. Bad for customers, bad for key employees, bad for business, necessarily, but it's a necessary evil to get the right buyer to the table. And once again, this is how an M&A advisor quarterbacks this process and makes it. The idea is you need buffers, and then this particular period is a key point of having that buffer. That way the company's less exposed to confidentiality exposures. And but like I said, the clock doesn't start ticking until you're in the market, and that you want to truncate. So you want to be prepared. You want to be ready, Johnny on the spot with the diligence. Like, we got to put something together. Like, they want to see profitability by contract. Should have had that ready before you went to market, because that will be a question that I will guarantee you get, and they want to understand, the per contract economics. So know that before you go to market. Don't try to do that in the middle, because that's what extends that orange bar and makes a deal a lot more, puts the outcome at risk, and the optimal outcome a little less likely. In that maroon period, you've narrowed down your buyers, you're really deep into diligence, you're negotiating the transaction, and you're working on the definitive agreements, whether it be stock purchase agreement or what have you. This is when the other parties are coming into play. And here, your M&A advisor is really quarterbacking between all those parties, the accountant, consultant, management consultant types necessary to end the process, attorneys, transactional attorneys from either side, the buyer from the other side. And so then you get to a close. But where the work you do in that first period, and prep is a big part of that, makes all this go all the more smoothly. And certainly you can get a deal done in 4 months. But where you could take all the time you want to prep, and that sort of blue and gray area. But once you hit the go button, you're on the clock, and every moment you're in the market, you could say that it's just like a house on the market too long. You want to be prepared and not have stop and goes. Any questions here?
I don't have anything. No, go ahead and
move on here. And so just to give you a sense of where, and I show this in a lot of my presentations because I think it hits home. The better your contract mix, the more full and open it is, the more prime it is, the better customers it is with, the margins on those things, the nature of that work, the higher multiple you'll be able to command. The more of that is set aside, the more of that is subcontractor, the less and less valuable you are. And so if you're, just I would, once again, you could sell a company in that maroon part of the table, but it's going to be for a lot lower multiple, and it's going to be a lot less of a strategic buyer, and it's going to be a lot less, it's going to be less optimal. But it may be, if you're in market, that's what's available. But you can't punch above your weight when it comes to contract mix. Unfortunately, you can to some extent with capability, but these are how buyers will assign multiples, typically based on the nature of your contracts and your pipeline. So, any questions here? And so we'll get a little deeper into understanding your sources of value. That corporate self-assessment. You want to dig deep into knowing what you have and where you have it and what the quality of that is. Think of it as SWOT analysis. Think of it as, but more of a, functional specific SWOT analysis. Okay, we need we don't have all of the statements. Our accounting is a mess. We kind of throw stuff together. We manage everything in QuickBooks or and Excel spreadsheets. We don't have really we have a very ad hoc bid proposal kind of arrangement. We kind of are reactive, not strategic. Do we have some of them are more block and tackle things, but some of them are more, it takes a little bit more thinking, and you got to put an investment of time, effort, and resources to kind of build out. Do it once again. How is our marketing strategy? What is our web presence? Do we have, how do we interact with customers? How is our bid proposal, and how do we, when we get an RFP, how do we respond? Is it, are we more strategic? And how do we onboard a new employee? And so all these things, you want to think about where you fit and what can be improved. And so once again, you want to be able to institutionalize these things. If it's all in the owner's head, this is all on autopilot, that might be good for you, but it's not good for the next person. You really want to give them the more turnkey your business is, the more valuable it is to somebody else. Give them a user's manual, even though it might be all in your head and it runs on muscle memory. That's not good to the next person that takes over.
So it sounds like so much of this is like documentation, physically writing things down and getting them out of your head, right? Like the processes, pipelines, goals. Yeah. Are there absolutely. What are some other aspects to that? Is it like communicating with your other employees that you would kind of hand off, or is it all just getting things in the SharePoint, the drive, or print it out?
Well, I think it's a combination of those things. The easiest thing is to put it on paper and then have everybody understand. Or even look, it may need to be adjusted. But I think communicating these things across the organization that everyone understands, and look, they can be changed, improved, and all the rest. But I think how you share them is important. But I think that you have them on paper, document somewhere is the first step, and how you sort of distribute that across the organization. That and I always say that for your pipeline, you need kind of CFO oversight of that. Don't let these things be silos necessarily. They kind of the left hand needs to know what the right hand's doing, and by documenting these things, you're better shot at doing it properly.
Cool. Thanks.
And so here would be, everybody loves dashboards. You see it in so many of these KPI things, but so you break it down by function, and you kind of say, okay, do we kind of, based on our peers, is this something we need to improve? Is this something that's kind of a critical fix that's really going to hurt us? Or is it something that, we could fix over time? Or is it something that it punches, we're above our peer group, and it's actually a value driver? And so, key, of course, is being objective about this and being able to be self-critical, but also is to keep stock of it. And then, okay, that you need to improve a timeline and a way to make accountable that you do that on a milestone basis to get that improvement, and what are those KPIs you need to see to measure it. But I mean, this is not, we've used something like this in the past, but this just gives an example. of something one might put together that kind of, once again, these things are, albeit they're put into categories, they're not, don't think of them as silos necessarily, because they all kind of drive each other. And we were talked about this a little at the beginning. To forward a successful, auction or any sales site process, you want to be able to have that compelling narrative, and that compelling narrative is read into all your documentation. What we just spoke about a moment ago, your capability statement, your pipeline, all these things have to be coherent, succinctly telling the same story. I'll be on the website, I'll say, oh, it's DevSecOps and all these things. I look at the pipeline, none of that is there. And so don't use buzzwords. It's not going to do you any good when it comes to time to sell. And it frankly probably doesn't do you much good when you're talking to customers if you can't deliver on it. The more pure play you could be, the more well you can articulate, the better you can articulate that pure play, the more that you check a box that's it's easier for someone to understand in diligence, the more they're willing to pay, the more interested they're going to be. And so that compelling, that's all part of that compelling, unified, coherent messaging. And then you don't need an enormous buyer pool. I like to say, you need more than one, but you don't need, at the end of the day, you don't need more than one. Only one person is going to buy it. But it needs to be big enough to be able to, often what we see in negotiated transactions, they drag on forever because, when you have one buyer, I like to say you kind of have no buyer because they always will wait for the next shoe to drop. And so they might siege the city and wait for it to burn down before they go in. And it's just, it's hard to hold their feet to the fire in that regard. But if you have even a little competition and competitive force there, it drives things to happen on a much more timely and a much more deliberate manner. And yeah, once again, we're going to get to the third point of competition and some urgency between them. You don't want to be on the market. We talked about time kills. You want to have some, drop, I don't want to say drop dead date, but some time envelope, if you will, and be able to have discipline around that and force those counterparties you're speaking to adhere to it to the best you can. And the more competition and the better that narrative is, the easier diligence is. The more buyer pool, the better, more discerning, smarter buyers will be able to process that information and can more credibly bid on your business. So I'd like to think these are the three elements you really want to cultivate and build into any process to be successful.
Another question that came in for you, in your experience, what's the best way for owners to respond when a deal falls through? Any recommendations?
When like an M&A deal falls through, I assume is what was meant. And to have options and to the extent that can you pick those pieces back up 6 months? You want to know why. You want to, and be aware of what other options are out there. It's like, oh, that one buyer doesn't like it. Well, we had 6 people in our management presentations. We talked to the one we really like, for every reason they can't do a deal. Well, there's 5 other ones. Or maybe there's some other buyers that'll come to the table. So have options. Know why. And because if something fell apart because somebody found something in diligence that's a deal breaker, well, the other folks that when they take a look, they're going to come to the same conclusion. So know why. And to the extent, yeah, you can mitigate the why and either fix it or take some time. If need be, yeah, you could put it on hold and reapproach those buyers at a later date. But I think it really, I think more than anything else, understanding why it fell through. Was it because your valuation expectations were too high? Was it they couldn't get financing? Was it that they got internally distracted, which often will happen with buyers, depending on how serious they are in the marketplace, or some other target or something internal is taking up all their attention. And so I think, and I don't want to be repetitive about, but knowing why and adjust accordingly. I don't know if there's a follow-up question to that, but that's how I would approach it. And look, it happens. And have options and know why, I think would be the way to respond to that. So, to break it down into what we're talking about, prep for sale, more broadly speaking, you do that self-assessment, knowing what you have, where you have it. You document everything you have. You institutionalize yourself. You figure out where you're weak, where you're strong, what can be fixed, what is not worth fixing based on the nature of the buyer pool. For instance, I go back to the house example. Why spend 40 grand fixing your kitchen if the buyer pool you've determined for that house wants it as a knockdown, right? You're not going to capture that value. So it's an ROI driven, process and thinking there. And then deploy the experts as you need them. Okay, so put your team together. Like, okay, we need to get a Q of E, accounting firm to look at things over. We want to talk to an investment banker. We need to talk to a wealth management group to the extent you don't have that relationship already, to maximize or minimize maybe the tax implications of liquidity event. Transactional attorneys will tell you some of the structures that kind of gel together. So put together the team that you believe you need based on the transaction you hope to have, and based on really the results of the self-assessment. If we can do a broad auction, or look, we have a very small buyer pool, so this is how we're going to take that second step. And then once you have that, you execute on the timeline and try to have measurable goals, of course, like anything else in business, and have milestones that are met on over a period of time. And if you fall short of them, understand why and adjust, and course correct as necessary. So once again, and some best practices to keep in mind when doing that self-assessment, when we talked about gauge report, we talked about the clarity report from Gov, when so much information in the sector is knowable, unlike other businesses, you could argue. And, not to overly pitch GovWin's solution, or Deltec, but that clarity report kind of says how companies fit into certain cohorts based on size. And to know, you could get deeper in, especially if the more info you have, you could really say what within those broader groups where you really fit, companies in your competitive landscape that are very similar that come up. And we certainly help with a lot of this ourselves. And if you can't do it internally, there's a lot of help. Pulse of GovCon amongst others, there's a lot of ways you could figure this out. But it's knowable, and do your homework before you go to market. Once again, the solutions you pick for, as you're prepping for sale, we kind of talked about with the house fixing the kitchen situation. Is it worth? If it's a knockdown, you don't fix the kitchen. And you got to think about, okay, what do we have resource wise? What do we have bandwidth? Labor wise, what do we have? What's the opportunity cost of those decisions? What is our timeline? And so you kind of you optimize it subject to all those constraints. And once again, when we talked about this a little bit too in the dashboard, so many companies I will talk to, our customers love us, and we're the best at all these things, and a little tough self, introspection is good here, of course, and being able to quantify it, and being objective about it, of course, because you're not helping anyone. When you're overselling what you have and the value of your customer relationships, these things can be read in CPARs. And so when you take an honest look at what those CPARs, and how as a buyer, if you were buying your company, how would you read into all that information there, and where would you see issues, or where would you have questions? And once again, the more proactive you can be about diligence and problems you can see that are going to come around the corner, because buyers are sophisticated, they're going to take their time. There's nothing you could, not that anyone wants to fool a buyer in the process, but there's not anything they're going to learn. There's not anything they're not going to learn in the process, because it's going to come out in a good process. And even if it doesn't, right, you're going to be penalized after the fact by the nature of the structure of the deal. And the more they're uncertain about, the more they're going to, the less cash that's going to be part of the component, the more that's going to be escrowed, and more that's going to be in what we call deferred contingent consideration in terms of earnout. And that could be made less or more draconian based on what they're able to ascertain based on what you've provided. Equity role, seller note arrangements, things of that nature, things that are held in kind of reserve. So there's a number of ways that you could help the more objective you are looking at your business, the more realistic and the more prepared you will be. And this is kind of speaks to what we've been talking about to the point the whole day, right? Assess your organization, be objective about it, understand and be able to communicate your unique value proposition. Be able to communicate why it's smarter for them to buy you than build it themselves. Because I guess you could argue that anyone can build it themselves, but it's better to buy than build. In fact, we talked about that on the first slide when that decision tree: do I buy, sell, or do I build? Well, you're trying to communicate to them it's cheaper to buy you than build themselves. Know your environment and market trends. Understand where you're fitting with those customers. Understand where your valuation is in comparison to your peers. And this is something we always get questions on, of course. Have that comprehensive set of buyers and know why, and have their one. If you could explain, if you put yourself, once again, think like a buyer. Why would they buy your company? What is a strategic advantage to them? And if it's they'll get another couple 2 million more of EBITDA, it's not good enough reason. Communicate that value. We kind of discussed this, I think, in pretty much in depth. But once again, can put yourself in that buyer's shoes. What's their investment thesis? Do you meet it? And be ready. Like I said at the beginning, be ready for yes. So many companies aren't. Run your business like you're going to have it forever, but be ready to sell it tomorrow if you need to. Would be what I would provide. And there's the second thing to take away from our discussion today would be that comment there. You run it like you're going to have it forever, but be ready to exit tomorrow if need be, or if the right buyer comes to the table. And I just wanted to provide, an example. We were talking about pipelines, and once again, I think a key document that you could read into it, and this is sort of a practical kind of look at it. What the anatomy of a good pipeline would look like. Now, some of you folks have great pipelines. Some of them you share internally, and it's a good management tool. But it's good to just have this, not just for sellers, but just as a way to you want to also too communicate across the organization. The best way to keep people in this highly competitive marketplace these days, perhaps more than ever, is to give them the sense that there's interesting work, and more sophisticated work for them to do. That will keep your key high-powered or high-flying employees happy and interested, and motivated. That you have more growing and interesting work for them to do, and that there's some variety in that, and there's kind of you moving up the value chain, if you will. And if you could show that, this is why, once again, what we were talking about before, like you're going to own it forever, but if you were ready to sell, you can. And once again, you can see all the attributes you should have in a typical good pipeline, and be able to share this. Now, maybe you want to redact some of these items in the first initial discussions with buyers, but you want to be able to have this internally and have, like I said, some kind of financial or CFO oversight of it too, to kind of discipline that pipeline. You're not just throwing, because I know, with a lot of salespeople, and we understand the need to more is better, but more is not better, because there's opportunity cost, and there's once again, we want to be able to read strategy into what's in your pipeline. And I could see that transformation, that evolution from, set asides to more full and open, more interesting, that you'd use that set aside work to kind of get that past performance that builds in, justifies capability, or articulates capability that gets you up the ladder. So you want to see that transformation, and you could read that evolution of a company in a good pipeline. And that be thoughtful with what you put in there, because it's not the cost of just putting another line item in is not zero, if you're seriously pursuing it. And when somebody sees something that's incoherent in a pipeline, they realize that you don't have a strategy, it's ad hoc, and it doesn't, if you win the work, now you got to do the work. And that might pull you in directions you don't want to necessarily be in from a optimal valuation perspective. And just think of it this way: not all money's green in this industry, and many of us have learned this the hard way. And any questions about this?
No, none's come in, but again, I cannot second the importance of an updated opportunity pipeline enough either. That's something we preach here as well.
And so once again, and just more in a qualitative way, the attributes of a good pipeline and a well-articulated pipeline that is shareable, should it need to be shared, but also amongst the organization that everybody's tied into it, because that's the work the whole organization is going to be getting at some. It's not just a bid proposal shop or the BD individual is that's his purview or her purview, and everybody else will just stuff will come when it comes. Everybody having a understanding what's in there is, I think, important to sharing that vision of what the growth plan is and what the work is that's coming down the pike. It gives a sense of you can manage resources better and keep people motivated. I think some employees want to see that mission, and they want to see that there's a rhyme or reason to the things they're doing, of course. And once again, so this expresses a coherent strategy. It's easily understood. It's it's articulated well. It's well put together. It's organized. It's not you could follow it. So many I'll see that's just flopped together. It's really hard to understand what the heck's in there. That also it understands that there's cost to anything you're bidding for that seriously bidding. There's an opportunity cost that goes along with it. And you got to service that work if you win it. And then once again, I've seen P win rates of 90%. I was like, okay, unless it's a recompete, it's not a 90% P win rate. And don't show me that and expect me to take that seriously. Now, as again, in different stages, okay, perhaps, but that can move up in a way, but have it justifiable, have it defensible, and have it realistic. You're not doing yourself any favors to put high numbers in there and to miss.
Richard, question on that. And Brian, you've definitely heard Lisa and Amber speak before based on this question. How much weight is really put into P-wins, considering that they're entirely subjective for the most part?
Well, I mean, that's what I was kind of getting at. They're subjective to a point because we can't quantify them exactly, but are they? I mean, I would argue they're not completely subjective. They have to be justifiable. And look, for whatever number you put in there, we could debate whether it's 80 or 90 or whatever, but have explanation why. It's like, well, we've done this work before. This is why it's in there. This is why, our customer intimacy is enough that we are confident. We have had conversations with the COTAR. We have had conversations with, you understand what the customer needs are. We've done this work in the past. So you should be, once again, reflect things in your CPARs will speak to this, that you've done a work that's at least adjacent to it, but you will be drilled down on it, but it's not pie in the sky. And if people just will throw a 50 in there or throw a 90 in there without any thinking. And if there's a takeaway here too, I think it just needs to be justifiable. Yes, it's subjective to a point, but there's a lot of evidence that supports it one way or the other, and being able to share that and articulate that, I think, is key to internal management of it, but also explain it to outsiders, buyers, capital providers, funding sources, things of that nature.
On that same thread, in your experience, what is an average realistic P-win, and what are the key drivers?
Well, I could tell you what the key drivers are. I mean, it's the past performance, it's the capability. Does it meet a capability that you've been able to do? Not necessarily even with past performance, but is it completely a customer that you have intimacy with? But there's no good or bad one. I mean, I could tell you a 50, one that's 90 that's correct, and there's one that's 50 that's just, but if things are 20, why are they in there? I would argue, they shouldn't be in there because it's not an opportunity that's worth pursuing. I think once again, you need something justifiable, but there's no good number or bad number. It's just, I would say, a number that needs to be evidenced with data, with past performance, with an explanation. And yes, it's more qualitative than quantitative to a point, but I mean, if I see things that are 20% or way too high, that's not a recompete, for instance, I'd want to know why. and be prepared to have to explain why. But there's no good number, but I would say, yeah, I think generally speaking, they should probably be, if you force me to answer this, so I will, in that 50 to 60 range. But it depends on where that opportunity is in the cycle too. And maybe it's north of that as it gets closer to. And when it's first, responded to a solicitation or what have you, where the stage of it changes that probability too. And how okay, we've been down selected and, and now we're going to go forward on this, or we have this vehicle. But yeah, I mean, to give good guidance on precisely where that should be is hard to do. It's really dependent on the opportunity you're going after based on the company's capability and past performance. And ability to deliver on it if you were to win it.
Mm-hmm. Love that classic answer of it depends.
I hate to answer that,
but it does.
But I'm afraid I did. Yeah, I try to give it a little structure, but